Hello, everybody. We'll get this started. Welcome to today's edition of Committee for Sydney Live. I'm Gabriel Metcalf, CEO of the committee. Our topic today is Agile Education, the future of universities in the post-COVID world. And we have an extraordinary brain trust joining us today to lead this discussion. So as we know, Australia has some of the best universities in the world. The sector is not only essential for advancing human knowledge, not only essential for building the skills of future generations, it is also one of the most important foundation pillars of the Australian economy. The sector has been hit terribly hard by COVID. For all the obvious reasons, because of the public health concerns about getting groups of people together, and because the borders are closed, which means that international students cannot get here. So today we are going to hear from 3 university leaders who will share their insights into what the universities are doing and want to do in response to the crisis. It is a chance to talk about options in the short and medium run, but also a chance to talk about longer term changes that could be on the horizon. Introducing these speakers, their resumes are filled with honors and awards. They serve on numerous high-powered boards of directors. I could go on, but what I'm going to do is simply give you their relevant titles for today, saving more time for you to hear from them. Belinda Hutchinson is the 18th Chancellor of the University of Sydney, a position she took up in 2013. I should mention that she is, as of this year, an AC, a companion of the Order of Australia, if I have that right. Barney Glover is Vice-Chancellor of Western Sydney University, and I should say he is also one of the people responsible for me being here. As a member of the Committee for Sydney Executive Committee. He's also board chair of the Powerhouse Museum, if any of you want to ask him about that. Paul Wellings is Vice Chancellor of the University of Wollongong, a role he's held since 2012. He's also the convener of the New South Wales Vice Chancellors. So the format here is each of the speakers is going to make opening remarks, starting with Belinda, and then we will open it up to questions, which you can submit via the Zoom app. Thank you for joining. Belinda, let's start with you.
Thanks, Gabriel, and it's great to be with you. And I thought I might start off by talking about the economic and employment contribution of universities in New South Wales and Australia more generally. Obviously, the world, Australia, and the higher education sector has faced a truly black swan event with COVID-19. And for us, it's meant, you know, like the aviation industry, the hospitality industry, tourism industry, a dramatic impact. That's for us meant closing our campuses, but also taking a very significant revenue hit. And I think, you know, most of people are aware that the university sector is looking at a $4 to $5 billion revenue hit this year. The University of Sydney has announced a $470 million cost-saving recovery program is needed. And, you know, we've really got a lot of work to do. I think most people see us as research and teaching institutions, and that's fundamentally what we are, but I don't think they truly understand the impact we have on the economy and employment more broadly. And the University of Sydney has just undertaken some independent research around that, which showed that we have actually contributed $5.3 billion each year to the New South Wales economy, and indirectly and directly created 31,000 jobs. Pretty impressive. And if you look at the universities around Australia more generally, I think the numbers are 150 billion per annum and 247,000 jobs. Pretty impressive numbers. So if we look at the post-COVID-19 environment, what does that mean for us? Well, I guess the biggest issue for us is what happens in terms of international students, because international students contribute around 40% of our revenue. So for all of us, it's really important that we get those international students back on campus so we can restore our revenue bases. And we're all hopeful that by January 2021, we'll be able to get some of those students back. And Gabriel and the Committee for Sydney has done a terrific job in putting forward some of the issues that we need to address for all of that to happen. So if that doesn't happen, though, it's a pretty scary outlook for us. And again, I'd like to quote some figures. I mentioned, the research we've done. Well, a 10% drop in international students in New South Wales is a hit of $1.2 billion to the New South Wales economy and a loss of 10,000 jobs. If we were to have a 50% drop in international students, that would mean a $7 billion loss for the New South Wales economy and 50,000 jobs. So if you multiply that out for the Australian university as a whole, you can see it's a very, very big number. And perhaps, Gabriel, we can talk more broadly around what we see as the value of international students to our universities in terms of research and teaching as part of the questions. But I just thought that was an important sort of setting of the scene. And then if we look again post-COVID, I think universities have already demonstrated through the virus and through the pandemic the value that they can create in terms of research around vaccines, around treatments, around pandemic management plans, and in terms of contribution around economic recovery plans. All of us have hundreds of our researchers working on those plans with state and federal governments. And I think that, again, is where I see the true value of universities in terms of research, and not only in that medical and health space, but also working very, very closely with industry. Over 40% of industry's research and development is done in partnerships with universities, and we just have to continue to build on that as we come out of this pandemic. So I think that's a really important thing to focus on. And I guess, for me, I would say the other thing that I think is kind of interesting to really talk about is how do we teach going forward? Because one of the things that has really impressed me, and it's not just at Sydney University, but all of the universities, is we had 96% of our units of study put online. So our students could study from home in under 5 weeks. Just an extraordinary effort. Now, our students are saying this is a really positive thing to have happened, and they're very grateful. They do want to get back to campus. But I think there is a lot to be learned about a blended online learning, on-campus learning experience. So hopefully we can take the benefits of that going forward. So that's probably enough from me, Gabriel, for the initial part of our conversation. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Belinda. Let's go to Barney Glover next.
Thanks, Gabriel. And thank you to the Committee for Sydney. It's great to be at a Committee for Sydney event, even if it's in the virtual context. And yes, I was part of bringing you to Australia, and I'm very glad I was. It's great to have you leading the Committee for Sydney. And I think it's very important that the Committee for Sydney is showing so much interest in what is a vitally important topic about our universities in Sydney. They're crucial to Australia generally, and Belinda's touched on some of that. But just in the Sydney context alone, the contribution our universities make to the fabric of our city is so crucial. And I'll come back to that. It's partly about the infrastructure. You only have to look in the CBD around UTS and University of Sydney, what's happening around UNSW, to get a real sense of the vibrancy of cities by virtue of the universities that are part of those cities. And it's not simply an ivory tower. It is part of the community, and university campuses are a crucial part. And for a whole range of other reasons, it's a multi-billion-dollar industry sector for Sydney alone, let alone for the rest of Australia and New South Wales. So very important that the Committee for Sydney is taking a deep interest in this and raising the topics today that we'll no doubt touch on in more detail during the Q&A. Belinda's outlined the impact at the University of Sydney, and all Australian universities have suffered by virtue of COVID, the closing of the borders, the response to the pandemic, the de-intensification of our campuses in order to to meet the health requirements of a pandemic, ensuring that the appropriate facilities continue to operate, because universities have never closed during the COVID crisis. We've maintained our operation, not just, as Belinda indicated, teaching online, which we've all done remarkably well. And as I say to many of our students who talk to me about this, I think at the moment, the best education you can get in the world is happening in Australia because of the way we've responded and the quality of very high quality online delivery of our programs that's underway at the moment. And 96, 98% of our programs went online so rapidly to deliver a world-class education. But of course, our facilities remained open. We've had study halls and support for students, a whole range of activity underway. And at the moment, we're planning return to campus. All Australian universities are looking at that because of the great success we've had in Australia in managing this pandemic and enabling restrictions to be lifted. And we're looking forward to what, everyone's talking about it, what the new normal will be. And I agree with Belinda, it will be very different. Because there's much that we've learnt in the last few months, many opportunities that have emerged because of the crisis and how we've responded to it that we don't want to lose in the context of the way universities will operate in the future. I did want to reinforce the message that Belinda sent though very much around the impact universities have on the economy, generally speaking, not just in the context of Sydney. Graduates have made a profound effect on Australia in so many ways, but the productivity of our graduates on the economy and on GDP is huge. It has been, particularly over the last 15 to 20 years, as we've seen universities grow and produce more graduates, and the contribution and the productivity benefit of those graduates in our economy has massively impacted in a positive way on our GDP, without even touching on the benefits of research and innovation, that critical connection between the immense research effort in Australian universities and the way that leads to innovation in our industry sectors and more broadly, and the impact that has on our economy. Economically, we are a powerhouse, individually and collectively, driving the Australian economy, and will be a vitally important part of recovery from the coronavirus. One of the things that occurs whenever you emerge from a crisis in Australia, and particularly where there's an economic downturn, you have the counter-cyclical behaviour in the economy, and that is that there's greater demand for a university education when the economy is suffering, when we move in, as we haven't done for a long time, but now into a recession, and that's happening globally. There'll be much more demand on university places, particularly in 2021, where we'll see higher levels of unemployment and particularly youth unemployment. And there's a direct relationship between increasing levels of youth unemployment and higher demand for higher education for all of the obvious reasons, as well as into TAFE and vocational training. So we need to be ready to respond to that. It's one of those areas where I think we're in dialogue with the Commonwealth at the moment in relation to how can we meet that increased demand that will emerge in 2021. The other point I wanted to make that's crucial about the impact of COVID-19, first of all, it's not a one-year impact. We all understand the financial impacts this year because of revenues being down due to borders being closed, the lack of international students coming in, campuses being de-intensified. So we have other revenue sources that are being constrained. It's not simply a one-year problem. It will be a multi-year problem. And we'll see in 2021 and 2022 continuing challenges in terms of the global recession and international mobility. We estimate at Western Sydney that to return to the levels of international education that we saw in 2018 and 2019 will literally take until at least 23 or 24 to recover. So we're looking at a 5-year or more recovery period, and a lot of debate and discussion going on in the media and more broadly about the size and the scale of Australia's international education sector. But it has been incredibly important to this country over almost 30 years. Universities have built the second or third largest export industry in such a short amount of time, a vital part of our economy, but a vital part of our universities and our communities. So how we rebuild over the next few years is going to be a very important part that we may want to talk about in more detail. The other point I wanted to make is to understand some of the other collateral impacts of what's happened. The precincts, something Paul and I are very much involved with, and the University of Sydney in Western Sydney, are the emerging precincts, whether it's at Westmead, the health and education precinct there, or in Liverpool, the opportunities there around the Liverpool Innovation Precinct, what's happening in Campbelltown as it plans its future, the enormous opportunities near the airport. Paul and I are both part of the Multiversity operating at the moment as an opportunity to develop a presence around the airport. The precincts, and then you go to Hawkesbury and Blacktown and Parramatta itself. These emerging precincts, this emerging urban regeneration is being driven largely by the contribution being made by the state government to health infrastructure, and importantly by universities willing to invest and develop major new campuses and facilities in Western Sydney. And we're seeing this more than generational change. We don't want to see that momentum held back because of this impact of COVID-19. We need to understand that this is going to be impacted if we don't see investment by government, support for universities, and opening up safe corridors. So as Belinda said, we can see a return of international education in the next few years, and certainly beginning in 2021. I won't go through, there are many opportunities, we've touched on them, new models of delivery of education that are emerging more rapidly than we may have thought, even though there are great online educational providers around the world, but all of us are now better equipped than we've ever been before. We're going to have many challenges to rebuild the Australian economy. We know that. We know post-pandemic, we need to build more self-sufficiency in a whole range of ways as a country. We need an evidence base to do that. We need research to inform it. Universities are going to be critical in that regard. And finally, and I think in an exciting way, we should explore new models of collaboration between our institutions, between universities, that will give even greater impetus to economic recovery. So I'll leave it there, but a great deal to reflect on when it comes to 2020 and universities and COVID-19.
All right, thank you, Barney. Paul Wellings, let's turn to you now.
Yeah, Gabriel, thanks for that, and thanks for the invitation from the Committee of Sydney as well. Without wanting to reiterate too much of what's been said, I think that there are several really important points. So on international students and economic connectivity, it's worth remembering that there are more than 95,000 jobs in New South Wales alone, which are dependent or were dependent on international education. So that's the 2018 figure. So roughly $12.1 billion worth of activity to the New South Wales economy alone. And if you look at the business sectors which are, tied to our international activities, they're pretty obvious. Health insurance, because every student requires to purchase health insurance, retail, banking, and tourism. You unpack the tourism figure for New South Wales, 40% of international tourism is linked to the families of our students, international students who come here. And that's because they stay longer, they've got greater purchasing power, they come to Sydney and visit iconic parts of Sydney, and then they travel around the state. So that's an enormous linkage. And I think we quite often lose sight of the connectivity between what looks like one arcane sector, international education, and its spillover consequences and the tie-up into other parts of the economy. Second point I want to make was around agility, which was one of the themes of this afternoon. Most business sectors in the current environment are working at 4 or 5 times the speed that they were working at before, and universities are not alone. So there's been a lot of innovation, a lot of change to business processes. As Belinda said earlier on, a large number of subjects have gone online. Here at Wollongong, we took a short pause while we did that. We've got 1,000 subjects up online, and we've done all of that and responded to the Commonwealth call across the sector to establish new higher education certificates, short courses, to allow people who might have gone on to unemployment to have the opportunity to do something that's relevant. So we've got a number of these products here. At Wollongong, our most popular product is business analytics, not a surprise. So people who are being laid off in their jobs, actually working out that they can enhance their skill set to go back into the workforce in a few months' time if they're lucky enough to pick up a job again. So that loop, I think, is well met. The third point I want to make in this introduction was around the nature of the New South Wales government and where that is, because they have a major predicament in front of them now. You know, the budget is under stress. As JobKeeper comes off in September, we'll expect to see unemployment rates go up. And as Barney said, that will put immediate demand onto higher education. We all worry about the skill sets and the post-school environment that this generation of people will then need in order to secure gainful employment in a post-COVID world. And I think the other thing that we've seen quite recently, reported in yesterday's Sydney Morning Herald, you know, the CapEx by the state government coming under a lot of pressure or getting switched off. So if I think about the focus of the government for Greater Sydney, clearly we need a policy framework around new industries and new jobs and what it is going to drive the economy for the future. Tim Reardon, the Secretary to the Premiers, spoke at a previous committee for Sydney the other day and talked a lot about the importance of the pathway for international, and I think all of us would agree with that. And I think the third point that many of us worry about are the routes back into Australia for highly talented workers that we need to secure to keep building our business systems. So if I sort of try and summarise what I think the top three issues are from my perspective, one is the return of international students in 21 and beyond. That unpicks the lock to many other sectors if we do that, because all these other ancillary benefits I touched on before start to get triggered again. So it is mission critical. And the thing that we need to know, I think, there is that the economic circumstances in China, India, and Nepal, which are three great markets, are all rather different. And we need to be quite nuanced about how we rebuild that international market, given the economic conditions will vary in our major partner markets overseas. Second point I want to make, and Barney touched on this, is about creating certainty for Year 12 students who are at school this year about getting a pathway into university for March in 21, and at the same time trying to build confidence for people who are going to find themselves out of employment and try to make sure they've got routes into our institutions in order to make sure that the skills pipeline for the state is actually ready to go as economic recovery picks up, because that's clearly the counter-cyclical role that higher education has played. And the final point I want to make was around the need to think about investment in translational research. We have a lot of small and emerging industries in New South Wales, and the chance to turbocharge some of those through greater collaborative partnerships with universities is very real. And the Committee for Sydney itself, of course, has done work on, you know, the patterns of foreign investment in R&D and inward investment into R&D. Sydney has badly lagged, and somehow we need to change that policy environment quite quickly in order to catch up. New South Wales universities are down about $2 billion in revenue, and that has all of the negative consequences that we touched on before. We've either stopped or slowed to a halt our CapEx expenditure. That is a major problem. We need to keep some of these major projects moving. There are immense risks now to the research fabric of the state, given the dislocation in budgets. And as Barney said, 2021 is a really big problem that we've really not bottomed out yet. Yet in all of that, we remain critical infrastructure, both for Sydney and for the whole of New South Wales. There's a risk here that we start to see recovery and we don't focus on inequalities. And one of the byproducts of COVID-19 is that we might find ourselves re-emerging in 21, 22, 23 without actually dealing with the consequential inequalities for different parts of our communities at the same time. So a lot to deal with in a very short time. That's my brief summary. Thanks, Gabrielle.
Okay, thank you. Wow, you have given us a lot of material. We have so many questions coming in. Let me start with a naive question, and maybe I'll give this one to you to start, Belinda. Is it a problem for universities to be dependent on international students at the current levels? Should there be reforms that change that, or is it not a problem? Is it fine?
Well, I think as Barney and Paul mentioned, I think, we should be lauded for the success, the entrepreneurial success we've had in building the third largest export industry for this country. You think it's an advanced service sector that we've built, and I think that's a great thing. I actually think for our students, domestic and international, it's terrific to have them both on campus. I think it really adds to their experience, and the students say that to us. It gives them an opportunity to mix with others. It gives them an opportunity to work in teams. That's what the real world is. The real world doesn't look all the same. It's not all just Australians. So it gives them an opportunity to actually interface and get that cultural experience, a cultural competency I think everybody needs going forward. But, and also I think these students go back to their countries and are wonderful ambassadors for Australia. Great in terms of building our relationships. So I go up to Singapore and China and Hong Kong regularly and meet our students, our alumni, our graduates. And, they're incredibly impressive, articulate young people who've got great jobs and actually are great ambassadors for Australia. So I actually think there's a lot of good. And I don't hear much criticism of the iron ore industry for having 82% of their exports going into China. So I do find the criticism of universities having built a very successful export sector, I just really don't get it. And the other point I would make is that there really has been a trend over the last 30 years of the university sector having to become much more reliant on its own funding. So for example, the University of Sydney, only 30% of our funding now comes from the federal government. The rest of it comes from international students, philanthropy, industry partnerships, all of those sort of things that we have built up ourselves. And I think that's a great thing. So, and if you look at the great universities around the world, LSE has 85% of their students are international. We're not anywhere near that at the moment. We're all less than 50%, we're around 40%. And we don't want to necessarily be like that. But, therefore I find the criticism sometimes, not understandable. Yep. Obviously there's risk and you have to manage it, but I think we've actually improved our educational offering as a result. And quite frankly, we couldn't do the research we do unless we had those HDR international students as part of our university. And I think that's really important. If we want to be really strong, internationally rated universities in research, we need those HDR students, those high degree students.
Can I add
All
to
right.
that?
Yeah, Barney, please. Just
to reinforce the important points that Belinda's made. And it's important to note that we don't operate in an environment where there's not significant international competition. Australia has done remarkably well for a country our size in competing internationally to attract students here to our world-class educational system. Now, we're up against Canada, we're up against the United States, we're up against the United Kingdom, we're up against increasingly very successful Asian universities attracting international students. There is a very large group of students mobile across the world seeking higher education. And I think Australia's done remarkably well in rising up to support that need right across our region. Plus, we're an incredibly successful multicultural society. And we see this in Western Sydney writ large. 170 different ethnic communities make up Western Sydney. We welcome international students to our university and into our communities. And our communities respond very positively to that. So I agree. I think that the criticism of universities for building international education doesn't actually stand scrutiny. And right now, every university in the country monitors its profile to ensure that we are seeking to look for ways to diversify and not be overly dependent in particular markets. And that's the nature of any system that's responding to global trends. We have been impacted by a major global crisis, and we're seeing downturns in many industry sectors. I think it's a very, very important time for Australia to look to how do we rebuild? How do we support universities to actually grow again our very successful international education sector?
Okay,
And
well then
I just
let's.
might add one more point, if I may, because I think one point that, I see is the criticism that, we've dumbed down our education and it's not nearly as good as it was. Well, I look at the graduates who come out of our university, and it's the same for all of our universities. They're unbelievably employable. So Australian universities rank very, very highly in terms of graduate employability on university rankings. So Sydney University ranks #1 in Australia, but we ranked 4th in the world. And there's a whole range of other Australian universities who are equally highly rated globally in terms of their graduate employability. So I think that actually debunks that myth around, well, we've dumbed down our university education. I just don't think that's happened.
Paul.
Let me make one very quick point about this question, because, the last time I looked out the window, Australia is still one of the great trading nations of the world. And at the risk of putting too many facts in front of you, world student numbers double in the next 20 years. Indonesia, India, and China will still be very, very large populations with growing middle classes. So this is a major market opportunity. And so, some people want to characterize onshore international education as a busted flush and something that we need to walk away from. In reality, we've encountered a systemic risk, as has many, many businesses. And universities, are struggling to cope with this short-term systemic risk. But beyond that, you can see that actually this is a major opportunity still for Australia and the UK and the USA and France and the Netherlands and Canada to actually deal with this. And we need to be competitive in this space over the next 2 or 3 decades.
All right, well then let me pivot to ask a question about taking advantage of that opportunity, of a doubling of the global demand. The committee, but many other groups have noted that there is a real opportunity in the crisis right now because Australia has managed COVID so successfully, demonstrating the virtues of being a country that is not too politically polarized, where leaders are capable of listening to science. And so the perception of lowered risk of many kinds, geopolitical risk, political risk, means there's an opportunity for global talent attraction, for inbound direct foreign investment, but also an opportunity perhaps to increase international students. What needs to happen in your sector to take advantage and convert on that opportunity? And maybe we'll do this in reverse order. Paul, I'll start with you.
So, I think it's the most obvious one, and it's the point that Tim Reardon made the other day, which is around trying to build a dialogue between the state and the federal governments around a safe and secure pathway for the movement of international persons back into Australia. So we've done that brilliantly in Sydney for returning Australians who've been overseas. We've had enormous confidence in the quarantine facilities that we've been able to put in place around that. And I think we need to actually build the argument around using that mechanism or a variation of that mechanism to secure sufficient volume to justify doing that for the future. Because you're right, Gabrielle, we're seen as a fair, safe and healthy environment to move into. So there's a small number of economies like that. And we have, at the moment, a major advantage when it comes to international students that our next academic year starts in March 2021, which of course will give us a 6-month lead on the Northern Hemisphere. So if we don't get our act together in time to link onto that, we will then lose out dramatically to the Northern Hemisphere. If we can build a secure pathway and demonstrate it in order to get sufficient volume for March 2021, then I think you most probably will see a whole range of economic activities coming back into Sydney and New South Wales that, based on the information we gave you before, will have enormous leverage back in, positive leverage into the environment. So that's my starting point, but my other colleagues will have slightly different views on that.
I mean, I'd happily come in on that before Belinda does, I'm sure, but I agree with Paul. A safe corridor is crucial. Get the student flow happening. There are many visa holders overseas at the moment. who are looking forward to coming, returning to Australia in some cases, or commencing students wanting to begin. And I must say, all of us have been impressed by the number of students overseas waiting to come who remain very, very keen. So we're not seeing the diminishing of that intensity of interest in an international education, and to make that incredible step that students do from overseas to go out of their country and go to another country to study. It's an extraordinary step to take. And we're seeing that enthusiasm that's there. So safe corridor, absolutely. I do think though, as we step into a world that will be even heightened in terms of competition for international students, you know, we've seen Boris Johnson issue a letter to international students about how welcoming the United Kingdom will be to international students in the future. And since he's been Prime Minister in the UK, we've seen a number of policy decisions, reversals of things that Theresa May had in place, which are making the UK post-COVID an attractive option for students. It's always been attractive, even more so. We look at Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand and how New Zealand will be, very small population, significant numbers of international students. Justin Trudeau in Canada. Very important to note that the rhetoric, the narrative from our leadership around the world is very influential when it comes to ensuring that international students feel safe and welcomed. And I think we need to see more of that from the Australian government, notwithstanding the complexities of geopolitics, but I think they need to be seen to be very welcoming of international students now and into the future, so we can rebuild our market share in a very competitive context. Because you're absolutely right, we've done remarkably well in relation to this pandemic. The rest of the world is suffering and continues to suffer. We see increasing levels of infection around the world. We're very, very, very fortunate. That gives us an advantage. And we can safely bring students in the ways that Paul outlined. But we need to get the national rhetoric right, the national narrative right as well.
I noticed you didn't mention America there, Barney. Belinda,
No.
anything you want to add to that?
No, I just support what Paul has said. I think that is so important because, you know, we're communicating directly with our students all the time and those who are in, you know, making applications for enrolment. And we're experiencing the same as this, and as Wollongong and WSU. We are getting very strong applications for students wanting to come in, but it is about us providing that narrative that they will be safe in Australia, that we want them in Australia, that they're welcomed. You know, so we're using lots and lots of mechanisms to directly communicate with them. And I think the State Premier has done a really good job on you know, in her messaging around students wanting them to come back to Australia. I think we just have to stay the course on that. And then the other thing I would say, just in terms of a longer term positioning, you know, we've invested a lot on our campus, as had all the universities, in terms of our facilities. And that has been really important for us. So you look at our business school, it's a really amazing facility for our students. That's why they want to come to our university. But you look at our research facilities in the science space, like the Sydney University Nanoscience Hub, you know, the students want to come because it's a world-class facility where they can learn about nanoscience and technology, quantum computing and things like that. You know, all of those investments, we have to stay the course on that. So, you know, all of us have a number of shovel-ready projects, which I think would be really important to help kickstart the economy post the COVID environment and the pandemic. I think we have to try and stay the course on those investments, because not only will that give an initial lift to the Australian New South Wales economy and the Sydney economy, but longer term, it provides for giving us a great environment within which to welcome students and give them the best possible educational experience. You know, I could go on with the list of, you know, priority projects that we've done, but you look at what Paul's got in his background and what Barney's got in his background, and you see, you know, what's been happening over the past few years in terms of rebuilding our institutions. We have to stay the course on that.
All right, let's then pivot to a hard topic, which is China right now. The Chinese government has apparently issued a warning to people considering coming to Australia to study, saying that they may be subject to racist attacks, that it may not be safe for them. So this is a very complicated question. Is it a real issue? And if so, what should be done to make sure that as much as possible, people have good experiences when they come here? Also, should Commonwealth government be doing anything more or different to heal the rift, heal the relationship at a geopolitical level with China in order to create the kind of climate you all are talking about? I don't know who wants to maybe speak to any piece of that first, but I've got a lot of questions have come in about one piece of this or another.
Well, I think
Barney,
it's
you want to start?
Very, very important issue, and I think we'd all, first of all, say that in the context of some of the comments being made by the Chinese government, they're not supported by the facts as I see them on the ground in Australia and certainly in Western Sydney, and I'm sure that's the case everywhere. We've heard a number of Vice-Chancellors coming out to say Australia is a very safe place when it comes to supporting international students, not just from a health perspective, from a well-being perspective. And that's why one of the reasons we've been so successful for so long. And that's still, despite these difficult and challenging times, still remains the case. And I think Australia needs to continue to push that very strongly as a voice to prospective students around the world. We would all be encouraging the Australian government and the Chinese government to improve the dialogue, to engage in the right level of diplomacy and discussion that's necessary to build the trade relationship to what it was. We're seeing a range of activities which are counterproductive to the relationship we have with our biggest trading partner. We need to have those issues addressed. We have great relationships. All of the Australian universities have great relationships with universities around the world, including in China, in joint research centres and joint research activity that's incredibly important for our own benefit in Australia as well as globally. And we need to maintain those links. And I know at the level of interaction I have with our colleagues in China, it's a very positive interaction. And we need to continue to build on those partnerships and to encourage the Australian government to recognise that and to engage in the right level of discourse so that we can improve what is currently a very fraught relationship.
And I would support that. I just think, we had similar messaging about 18 months ago when there was an issue. You only need one issue of security and safety for that to be potentially blown out of all proportion. But when you look at Australia as compared to any other place in the world, we are one of the most safe environments. It's been actually fantastic to see some of our students at Sydney come out and publicly state they find it a very, very safe campus. They find Sydney a very safe city. These are international students who are speaking out on behalf of the university and their fellow students. So I think the reality is, as compared to the rest of the world, we are a very safe place. Were there some racist comments during the pandemic? Yes, there were, but they weren't substantial in number. And I think the point that Barney's made about our largest trading partner, we need, at our level, we can get on with our job, and we are doing that in terms of dealing with and working with our international students and the agents that we deal with, and directly communicating with them. We have our relationships with Chinese universities. I think it's really interesting, a stat I saw recently, that China and US are their most important partners in terms of research at university level. So for all of the noise that we have about China and the US being in a spat, their research between their universities is the most significant of any relationship in the world. So I think, we need to get on with that job, but I think it is very, very helpful if the government, the Australian government, can help us bring the relationship back to a smoother level and send the messaging out. Obviously, diplomacy is better conducted behind closed doors than through the media.
Yeah. An interesting question about how the recession is going to affect your next cohort of graduates. It's hard to graduate into a bad economy. It's hard to get started. It's always hard to get started, but especially in a down economy. what is your thinking about how this experience is going to go for them?
I think, Gabrielle, it's going to be an extraordinarily tough world for graduates in this short period. I mean, it's pretty obvious that we're going as a country into, as will many countries, into a fairly sustained period of austerity. And I think Barney's earlier answer about, the length of time for recovery of universities, tells you how deep that problem is going to be. For the graduates, I think they will go into possibly the worst job market in 40 years, and we shouldn't try and gloss that in any other way. I think it is going to be extraordinarily tough. And the one thing that I think all of us know in universities is that quite often people stay on and build additional professional skills based on top of their first degree. And I think we need to find ways of making sure that students can go into taught course postgraduate environments and things like that in order to build additional ancillary skills. And I think the other interesting question for us is what's the role of our activities in enterprise development and entrepreneurship, and how do we actually assist graduates in setting up some of their own enterprises? Most of our universities now have excellent accelerators and incubators associated with them. And I think there's an opportunity there, possibly linked with the state government, to actually say, can we actually do something which allows people not to necessarily to get into employment, but to actually set up their own activity. One of the great paradoxes in the unemployment data and the graduate destinations data is that if you set up your own business, it's not seen as a graduate track job. So there's a little trick there that you can change quite quickly in a policy sense to say that's a legitimate route to a graduate track job. And there's a trick there that the state government, for fairly modest investment, could actually unleash capability of this generation of people to actually just give an idea a go. Many of those ideas will fail because that's the nature of startup companies. But you never know, there may well be latently out there some brilliant ideas that get traction. And I think we have to do a range of experiments of that sort rather than just saying it's a tough world and people will cope and float by themselves. Because I think we do have a duty of care to say, as people leave, that we can help support people in that market, because it will be very, very tough, possibly for a decade.
And I think if I could just support Paul in that, and particularly around accelerators and incubators, and we have Launchpad in Western Sydney, and the Committee for Sydney, just before I think you arrived, Gabrielle ran a great session with some entrepreneurs out of the UK who talked about during the austerity period in the UK, which is still ongoing, but the way in which people responded using the entrepreneurial spirit of the community to develop new enterprises, new technologies, new SMEs. I think we do need to nurture that part, and universities do a great job in that regard. I think it's also important to note, even though it's going to be a very tough environment, this experiment we've just done with short courses, with the undergraduate certificates that Paul mentioned earlier, we've seen with the students that are enrolled in that have come out of losing their job in one sector, it might be hospitality and tourism, and wanting to re-skill for the health sector, perhaps for disability care or mental health and counselling or another area, and looking to change career using new credentialing. In this case, it's a bit of a micro-credential opportunity. We'll see more of that to help people to upskill and to be more employable in a tough environment. But one thing that has prevailed for decades is the relative advantage a graduate has in terms of employability compared to a non-graduate. And that will prevail. It may be tougher, but there'll still be a benefit associated with having a university qualification. And I think Paul's right. People will add to that through a variety of means, postgraduate study, micro-credentialing. That will encourage, I think, more and more people to upskill and find their way through a very tough economy.
Let me change gears and pose a question about the longer term future of higher education. Many people have argued that COVID is accelerating trends that were already in motion. The one that gets talked about the most is working from home. And so a lot of speculation going on now about how that might spatially reconfigure metropolitan areas, if indeed that becomes a bigger trend. In higher education, you all talked about how you moved online, something that was, I think in many cases, resisted by some parts of your internal organizations, where people got over the resistance and maybe discovered it was actually not so bad. Where is that headed? Maybe just speculating a little bit about how the educational offering might end up changing. I don't know who wants to start.
I'm happy to give it a short go,
Yeah,
but
Belinda.
I think that Paul and Barney are probably better placed to talk about it than I am. But I think it's interesting that, you know, back in 2012, Time magazine named MOOCs, you know, the idea of the year, you know, massive online open courses, and it was going to take over the world and university was going to close down. And here we are in 2020 and we've all got more students.
Uh-oh.
I think, you know, the thing for us, I'm sorry, did you lose me then?
Yeah,
Apologies.
but you're back.
So, yeah, so I think in 2020, you know, it showed that that really didn't happen. But I do think, I think for undergraduate students, I think they want an on-campus experience. But as I mentioned earlier, I think there might be a blended online on-campus experience that we can give them, which is better. But I think in terms of postgraduate courses, I think you'll see more online capability being done. And you know, I've got one of my daughters who's doing an online master's in psychology, and, you know, actually finding it to be a really, really well done course. But I think there will still be some amount that's done on campus. You'll need to do some amount on campus, but I can see a much greater amount being done online. And then when you look at businesses are not as necessarily keen today to have their people out of their organizations for 2 years to do a master's, but they are prepared to have their people do an exec program, like an exec MBA or something like that. So I think, you know, you're going to find a much greater, you know, variation in how university study is done. And I think there's a lot more opportunity, but I'd be actually really interested to hear what Paul and Barney have to say.
Yeah,
well,
Paul, you want to go?
You want to jump in, Paul, first, and then I'll follow you.
Yeah. Oh, I'm with Belinda. You know, I don't think that, you know, MOOCs or Microsoft University are going to take over the world. I think that you know, 50% of learning, you know, is through student to student and student to staff interaction on campus, and there's quite a big literature to support all of that. And, you know, I think the real gain that we're going to make is having gone to remote learning and being able to show that things like lecture capture technologies work, that, you know, at one level we'll get efficiencies in our sector because we won't have to double and triple teach those lectures. We'll be able to put them in a can and allow them to be multiple viewed in different ways. And that will free up time for different types of interactions between students and staff on campus. And many Australian campuses are, you know, really great places to be on if you're, you know, active in the student community. So I can see that actually being a strength for the future. The other side of the lecture capture thing, and actually my memory is that, you know, Cornell in the late 90s was a mover in this space. They thought they were going to have different cohorts of persons watching lecture capture material that there was going to be in the classroom. When they actually analysed the data in the late 90s, they found that it was the same students who'd been watching the live lecture in the morning were in their dorms in the evening reviewing that material and making additional notes, having watched the lecture a second time round. So, you know, we use these technologies of the sort we're using now in lots of different ways. And I suspect that students will actually have an expectation of the technology availability and the chance to engage in different ways with that technology and the way we've used it. So my sense is that we will get efficiency, and what we'll see driven by the student body is a demand for more innovation.
Yeah, look, I'd agree with Paul. There's already been a great deal of innovation around Australia, around the world, when it comes to using technology interactively to enhance learning. I mean, we've been flipping the classroom in universities for more than a decade, and that's been very, very successful to move away from a lecture tutorial mode of delivery to much more about learning studios and collaborative learning spaces. What this crisis has done, though, and this is the figures for us, 2,500 staff were upskilled through professional development activities about digital tools for online delivery in a matter of weeks. And, you know, that would be unheard of in a decade. So colleagues have become more familiar with the opportunity that a technology like Zoom presents to get a very rich experience, a sort of conversation that we can have, but in a classroom environment. And that's given rise, I think, to the sorts of additional innovations that we may see. You're right, Belinda and Paul, about the campus experience, which students love, but there'll be more hybrid opportunities. There'll be more blending, as Belinda said, much more than we even have now, because it gives us this opportunity to bring more people into the educational experience and to make sure that, for example, for our staff, one of the, I think, the additional great benefits from this experiment that we've been in due to COVID-19 is that flexibility in the way people work, both for our professional staff and our academic staff, is going to become a very important part of our future. The way in which they can work from home more flexibly and realise that the technology platform is there for them to help them engage with their colleagues and be productive in the workplace. That's going to be quite a significant change that we'll have to come to grips with in a very positive way in the future. So there's no doubt, Gabriel, the world will change. There's much that we've learned in this experience rapidly, and I know in our universities we'll adapt and we'll develop and we'll differentiate ourselves as a result of it.
All right, I'm going to give a final question that somebody submitted that I really like. If you were speaking to a group of year 11 and 12 students in high school, wondering what this disruption means for their future and their dreams of going to university, what would you say to them? Maybe we'll do this in the order we started. Belinda, Barney, then Paul. Just a brief, what would you say to them?
I would say this has been probably your biggest learning experience in your life to date, going through the pandemic. And you will pick up an awful lot of really valuable learnings through that time. I don't think you need to worry, because when you look at the ATARs, it's based on an averaging. So everybody's going to be in the same boat, and the universities are going to welcome you. We're going to want you the same as we wanted you before. So don't worry about it. We just look forward to coming to university and enjoying it.
Look, I would be very positive. Yes, it's going to be a challenging recovery. Yes, Australia's in recession. We have great capacity to learn from the experiences, Belinda said, and I would be encouraging young people, more so than perhaps at any other time in the last decade when we've had, you know, years of growth in the economy and great job opportunities. In that sort of environment, even more important, I think, to achieve as much education as you can, and in an environment where you get opportunities for work placements, opportunities for community contributions, ways in which you can enhance your skills, get involved in the way technology can enhance the learning experience. I think I'd be very positive about the next few years, and I'd encourage young people to engage in higher education, to enjoy the experience. And I'm sure over the course of the next 3, 4, 5 years, Australia will emerge stronger for the experience.
Paul.
Yeah, I'm sort of with the others on this. I think the really important thing is whatever the students do, they should make sure that they go into post-school education, because the added value of that, whether it's TAFE or university, is just enormous for them. The idea that they would try not to do that, and it was just such a high-risk thing to do. Second point is obvious: don't take a gap year, because there's nowhere to go in that sense. So coming straight onto university, and then I think Belinda's right. The cohort coming in from the 2020 experience will always be special. They will have a set of skills that previous generations of undergraduates didn't start with as 18, 17, 18, 19-year-olds as they came in. And I think they will come into university, they'll challenge us in different ways. They may well have a shortage of key skills to go into particular courses. Most universities are already saying, what's the wrapper we need to put around this cohort of first-year students coming in March 21 to make sure that they're going to become second-year students and complete their degrees, because that's in all our interests. So we're already making that investment, having those discussions at New South Wales Vice-Chancellor's Committee, and we really are looking forward to March 21 and to welcoming this year's Year 12 students joining us as soon as they can.
All right, I believe anyone who tuned in today would leave this, this discussion feeling like we are in good hands. Thank you for everything all of you are doing, leading your institutions, and in that sense, building the future of Australia. It's just extraordinary.
Thanks,
Thanks,
Gabriel.
Gabriel.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks to everybody for listening in. Thank you.
Yeah, so everyone, thank you for tuning in to today's edition of Committee for Sydney Live, and we'll see you at the next one. Bye, everyone.
Yeah.